Hey guys, in this video I'll rank all God of War Ragnarok main story bosses from worst to best, meaning only mandatory bosses that you need to beat in order to get to the end credits. I considered counting all the optional fights as well, but, well, I guess I kinda wanted to have a life after all. All bosses will be in tiers going up from awful, bad, mediocre, decent, good, great, and amazing. Also, I'm playing on Give Me Balance, aka the default difficulty. I felt that's the most fair way to judge the quality of the bosses, because pretty much whenever there's difficulty options in video games, they only playtest the normal mode and the rest is just scaled however the fuck. So let's begin at number 18, the worst in the game. I've had 2 kidney stones in my life. Both times it was absolute agony, and you know what? I wanna retrospectively name them Soul Eaters, because they're a pain in the dick and I want them to piss off. Not only are the Soul Eaters directly yoinked from the previous God of War, and not only do they have 2 of them at once, like this is fucking Elden Ring or something, and not only are there crowds of other enemies everywhere, and not only... You know what, I'm gonna stop it there, because there's so many bad things to list, this is gonna get repetitive. These bosses are just walking turrets with uninteresting mechanics. They're invulnerable to all threats, physical or magical, until they flash at you, while simultaneously shooting projectiles. It's just really boring, and honestly I thought they were trash bosses on their own in the previous game. So having 2 of them at once is really not a blast from the past. The attacks of the 2 bosses overlap, they don't really synchronize their attacks in any way like some of the other gank fights in this game do, and there's no pillars or rocks or anything to provide cover. All this makes it as annoying as it is boring. Even though I'm moving around and it's intense, I'm somehow falling asleep at the same time, and the placement of the fight is really awkward. Just when you're about to talk to a long-awaited character, he just slaps you away so you can have this complete filler fight. This is one of those times where I just genuinely felt like my time was being wasted. So what I'm really trying to say is that fuck this boss fight. Let's move on. So to clarify, this is when you fight the Forest and Frost Ancients singularly at different points in the game. There thankfully isn't an ancient duo, to my knowledge anyway. Now since they're called Ancients and not Soul Eaters, you might wonder if they're noticeably different. No. They have slightly different attacks, but it's the same boring concept. Green and red light simulator. Wow. Incredible. And it's also lifted from the previous game. If they didn't exist in that game, they'd be slightly higher in the bad tier. But the fact that they're reused from the game that already reused them multiple times solidifies their position in the shittiest tier possible. Fuck them! Dreki isn't really bad in any way, it's just a little mini-boss lizard that's irrelevant to the story, other than showing that Atreus is a big dum-dum. It's at least appropriately easy for the early parts of the game and serves as good warm-up for the Dreki duos you'll encounter later in the game. On its own though, I mean, it has 6 attacks, it can't really be that great, but it does do some proper boss things. It sometimes jumps back or summons a lightning AoE to create distance so it can do more ranged attacks, and that's always a good idea for spicing up the fight, since there's no reason to be at range otherwise. I also find parrying them to be immensely satisfying. This guy looks fucking badass. He's armored like a wild hunt warrior and he's using a switchblade from Nioh 2. That's an instant W. But because of how frequently I've fought other Einherjar captains that either look similar to him, or are literally him, he doesn't really stand out in the end. He did kick my ass on my first fight against him, so I'll give him that. Since his weapon has such a long range, it's not enough that you just dodge out of range for some of his unblockable moves. You also have to dodge in the right direction to evade it. So it's a decent mini-boss, but if we're gonna put him in the same tier list as literal gods, well, this is pretty much where he belongs. So Björn is this game's tutorial boss, and as such, there's about 2 whole mechanics. Since it's the first boss, I can't really fault it for it, and I do appreciate that it's a wholly unique fight. You never fight this bear again, because it's Atreus, and I guess child abuse is kinda bad. I will say that the twist is the coolest part of the fight. Now, does that mean that the reveal was awesome, or that the fight is lame? A bit of both, probably. I'd wanna try to replay this boss so I could get a better grasp of how it feels to fight now that I've beaten the game, but for some reason, I'm literally not allowed to start a new game. It just freezes on a depressed Kratos. He's probably seen like a prophecy of all the unskippable cutscenes ahead of him, and he's not ready for it. But then again, the coolness factor of this boss is probably only present the very first time anyway, so I don't think I'm really missing out. ALVA is the Light Elf equivalent of Swartlejever, but I think in every single way, including the pronunciation of the name, is easier this time around. She's a fucking joke. If you're just highly aggressive, you can keep her stun locked for the entire fight and there's nothing she can do about it. I will give her points for coolness though, mainly for the twin blade that can be detached into two little swords. That's nice. She also introduces a new mechanic to the game, the interruptible attacks. You can't dodge them, you can't block them, you can't parry them, but you can interrupt them. They're a fine mechanic overall, but once you've seen one of them, you've seen all of them pretty much. Just run up to the boss and whack them with the shield and you get free damage. But yeah, overall she's fine. The Phantoms are a manifestation of pure magic, I believe, and the visual representation of it is great. They really do look like it. But they're also a manifestation of punching bags. There's the rare instance where I have to dodge or parry something, in which case it can be a little hard to tell what it's doing since it's a formless cloud of ice or fire. But once you know when to look out for them and which animation is which, it's pretty fun. I don't think the destructible pillars as the only way to damage the boss really adds much to the fight, but they fit thematically well enough, so I don't really mind. And even though the animations can be a bit unclear, they do look really nice. That's the best part about the Phantoms. Dreki Duo, while still as irrelevant to the plot as the singular Dreki encountered earlier, is exactly how you should make a gank fight on a basic level. It doesn't exceed the premise to unexpected heights, but it's got the correct foundation. The lizards take turns in attacking you, sometimes one is aggressive, the other one stays at range or dives into water to spew poison at you, and guess what? That works. I find it so fucking embarrassing that this one fight in God of War Ragnarok, 2 random alligators are straight up better than any duo fight in Elden Ring. Just copy paste the philosophy of this boss and paste it onto Godskin Duo and boom, you've got a great boss fight. I will say that the one downside to the Drekis is that I can kinda just ignore the other one most of the time. The ranged attacks are pretty slow and unthreatening. Huntress gets kinda built up as a formidable foe. You see her dragging enemies away to their demise, and when she ambushes you, they do a slow reveal of what she is, first showing nothing but her hooves. It made me expect something a little more important to the story than just a nameless mini-boss that gets repurposed multiple times. But I do like the placement of the Huntress. It's most likely the hardest enemy you've fought so far, and it's got the comedic timing.
I've seen my share of bloodshed, but this is an awful lot for one morning. Oh no!
Her toolkit is fine, not really anything out of the ordinary, just a bunch of ranged attacks and a kick if you get behind her, but it's your approach that's unique on account of having to fight her with a broken shield. I'm a parry god, so not being allowed to use my shield really fucks me up. It's a built-in reaction and I have to fight my own muscle memory more than the centaur. There's also the weak spot, which is satisfying to exploit, and it's a good tool to teach the player early on to get used to throwing your axe mid-combat. That's gonna help you down the line. But now we're finally done with the decent tier, so I'm happy to move on. Heimdall is such a fucking douche and I love it, and I hate it.
I am haunted by your incompetence. It keeps me up at night.
He's also our first actual, real, unironic boss. All the other ones so far on this list have been more like mini-bosses. Heimdall is like what demigods in Elden Ring are, the major bosses. These guys matter. But out of all the major bosses, Heimdall is without a doubt the weakest. If you're looking at this fight, it's kinda hard to believe it's an actual god you're fighting. First, he's riding a tiger, which is a regular enemy you can fight anywhere in the game. I still do like fighting them, so I'm not super upset by this, but maybe it's not the strongest intro phase for a god boss battle, you know? Especially when it's accompanied by a soundtrack lifted from the first game. But once he's dismounted, the most interesting part of the fight begins. He's not really trying to kill you, he's just taunting you. He's completely confident in you not being able to hit him, and I like what they did with it. They showcase his personality in gameplay perfectly. However, what you're supposed to do here in order to damage him is to throw the spear, which you can detonate from afar. I'm not sure how much sense this tactic makes from a story perspective. He's supposed to be able to predict everything you do, and while this detonation trick does surprise him at first, why does he still fall for it after? Why does he just stop trying to dodge you in the final phase? Is he so mad that he's lost his ability to predict everything? I guess I'm not supposed to think too hard about it. But that final phase of the fight should have been great. But aside from his maniacal laughter, I found it lacking. It's good for a mid-tier fight, but again, he's a fucking god. He just runs at you and does AoEs. That's about it. It's not as grand as it should have been. Now, maybe part of the reason I was so happy to do this fight was because I was bored out of my mind throughout this chapter. The Ironwood chapter, it was so fucking slow and boring. So an honest to god solid boss fight was a sight for sore eyes. And it's a very unique one at that. You're not allowed to hit her as she's Angerboda's grandma and she wouldn't want harm done to her. Instead, all the damage must be done to the cauldron. Which is gimmicky, sure, but I'd rather do that than tickle her feet. I've done way enough of those types of giant bosses. This is better. I think the best word I have for this fight is clean. The layout of the arena, the use of different platforms and the candles to stun her, the different spells she uses instead of just stomping around, it's all done pretty well. Now, as for the difficulty, well, it's a joke. I feel like there's a phase missing. If she went completely bonkers at the end and started thrashing around, destroying the entire room, that would have been cool. As it is, both her and Heimdall are like low tier good fights. I originally had them both at the top of decent, but I felt like that tier was already getting crowded. At first glance, Vanadis might seem like just another Valkyrie from God of War, which it is. It's a recolored Valkyrie, but with a highly modified moveset. There's very little that remains from the old versions. I think the only disappointment is that this is the one and only fight you get with Freya. You don't even realize it's her you're fighting until it's already over. With so much build up to the final confrontation between her and Kratos, I would have expected something more dramatic. She should have been shouting and raging like Thor does in his last fight. Still though, what matters most is how fun the fight is, and they did get that part right. She's quick and utilizes bow attacks with follow-ups, which can be a little tricky since those follow-ups are uninterruptible. So if you parry the bow and do the parry attack, which is basically built in my reflex at this point, you're stuck in that animation and get hit by her follow-up. So again, fighting my own reflex is kinda half the battle, but it's still a far cry from what kind of fight I would have imagined for Freya. She doesn't even use her vines or resurrective powers. Baldur's final fight was actually a better representation of her powers. So Vanadis is a good Valkyrie fight, but a bad Freya fight. Look, we all wanted God of War Ragnarok so we could fight Thor. It's the #1 reason. Baldur was cool, but who the fuck cares about Baldur? Thor is the Norse god. And I'm glad they didn't make us wait long, it's the second boss in the game. They basically do the same with Thor as they did with Baldur in the previous game. You fight the tutorial boss, then after some cutscenes the big bad villain comes to your doorstep and you have a highly destructive battle against them, but it's all a warm-up for the eventual refight at the end of the game. And I'd say this is a good teaser. It's definitely fan service, but in a good way. It's got memorable moments like Thor killing you in what at first looks like failed QTE, but then in the middle of the loading screen he brings you back to life using his Mjolnir like a defibrillator. That's amazing, even though I saw it coming because I would never fail a QTE, unless it's the old God of War games or RE4 or any game from early 2000s. That was a dark era of QTEs, good god. The fight itself though, story-wise you're both holding back, and that kind of translates to gameplay as well. Thor just wants you to show him the Ghost of Sparta version of Kratos. Kratos doesn't. And, well, there's also the fact that this is early in the game, so you don't have most of your abilities, so you can't really go apeshit yet. I see this boss more as like an interactive cutscene because the combat is a bit sluggish, but it's one hell of a cutscene. So NIDHOGG kinda just comes out of nowhere and is tricked into fighting you and then dies in vain.
Odin used her.
And she unwittingly paid the price.
Classic Odin.
I guess the one purpose she did serve was to give us a good boss fight. She's not your typical dragon, she doesn't fly around and breathe fire. Instead, she climbs on trees and pillars and uses realm tear magic. She can even stick her tail through the realm tear to remotely stab at you. That's a nice use of her powers. She is rather stationary though. Generally just hangs on a pillar and does a handful of attacks from there, and the only thing that complicates it is the awkward camera. It gets more interesting as the fight progresses and she starts using Bifrost beams and opening up her belly to suck you in and shoot projectiles out. It gets really fun in like the last 20 seconds, but then it's just over. It's a cool fight, but because of the lack of build-up and desire to kill her, I think most people won't have too many fond memories associated with this boss. But that's it for the good tier, we've got some great things ahead of us. HRIST and Miss uses the good gank fight foundation laid out by the Dreki duo, and this time both of the individual bosses are actually really good. Though instead of one being at a distance and occasionally shooting weak projectiles, the other Valkyrie is usually attacking Atreus for some time until the two switch around. Their teamwork shines whenever they do coordinated attacks. Like, there's lots of attacks where they, for instance, fly away, grab a boulder and then sling it at you, or do different kinds of consecutive charge attacks. This is the kind of shit I dream FromSoft would incorporate into their games. Look, I know I've been mentioning Elden Ring a lot in this video. No, I'm not saying God of War is just like Elden Ring, just like Dark Souls. It's just, I'm mostly a Souls YouTuber and I'm still seething about the ganks in Elden Ring. But this is one of my favorite duo fights in a long time. And I gotta point out how absolutely amazing the scenery is. One of the coolest looking arenas I've seen for a boss. Now, of course, these two are another Valkyrie reskin, but when you're having so much fun, does it really matter? I guess it matters enough for me to put them in great tier instead of amazing, but it's really not far off. And here it is, the battle we've been waiting for. The no bullshit, nothing held back fight against the God of Thunder. And I don't think it disappoints. I was worried they'd just add like 2 or 3 new attacks to the original Thor fight, but no, this is unrecognizably different. He's zapping around everywhere to the point I sometimes lose lock on, there's lightning striking everywhere on the ground, and his combos go on for far longer. And there's the emotional stakes as well. Throughout the game you've seen that Thor is a tragic character, abused and gaslighted by his father, with drinking being his only comfort. He's pretty much Odin's mindless puppet. You don't really want to kill him, you want him to see reason. Instead, he's just out of control mad.
Thor! This is what through
Keep her name out of your damn mouth!
It's a thrilling battle, and I really like his moveset. Again, the zapping and zooming around is really cool. The boss being mobile is always really important to me, I've noticed. And I like how much the direction of your dodges matters. There are some attacks where you need to dodge backwards, and others where you need to dodge sideways. While I do like straightforward fights that have minimal cutscenes besides phase transitions, which is what we get here, I do feel like maybe the spectacle is a little bit lacking. I mean, you have Ragnarok, the total destruction of Asgard, as the backdrop, but they don't really do much with it. Like, look at what they did with Baldur in the last game. It was absolutely insane how they used the zombie Thamur to create a wild ride of a battle. Something more along those lines would have been nice, but I'm not disappointed with what we got, it's just that it didn't blow my mind. GARM is the most OG God of War boss in this game. It's a massive spectacle, you're fighting a foe that no army could even defeat. I think one of my gripes about these new God of Wars is that you don't often feel like you're a god. If anything, I feel like I'm the underdog when I'm fighting groups of enemies. I can't even fucking jump! And I feel GARM is a return to form in some ways. The combat isn't anything crazy, but it's enjoyable enough to let you feel cool. And surprisingly, camera is never an issue. The giant wolf is pretty much always fully in the frame, and that's a relief. The first half of the fight is a bit more straightforward. You dodge the big bites and then punish. Occasionally there's a shockwave or an icicle thrown at you. I love how it can use the chain as a weapon though. Once GARM is killed, it appears to be over, and I thought it was a fun boss at that point. But then it comes back a few minutes later, and that was a memorable moment. That's when I knew this boss was something else. The second health bar is more gimmicky, but I think I like it more. Most of your damage will come from hitting his weak spots from afar with the spear, but it doesn't feel like it's too on the rails. You can still do as much melee damage as you want, and you can still hit the weak spots while the boss is moving, so good aim is rewarded. And it makes me happy that in the end we don't kill the beast. Instead, Atreus, well, if you've played the game you know, it's a little messy to explain. One negative, which isn't really about the fight itself, the music. It's a sneakily edited soundtrack from the first game. It's almost completely identical to the dragon theme. Just listen. Odin, the final boss of this game, is like half a dozen boss fights back to back. It has more phases than I can count. And like quite a few great final bosses are, he's the culmination of everything you've learned and seen. He puts all you've learned to the test, and he does it majestically. He uses every single magic type in the game. He forces you to utilize the different platforms, kinda like Gorilla. He uses all 3 different armor types, and he also forces you to throw your weapon to prevent a barrage of fireballs. I like that you only need to hit one of them and your companion will shoot the rest. In my opinion, Odin is the best sorcerer boss I've ever fought. Usually this type of bosses are really annoying, they keep teleporting away from you and are unreasonably spammy. Odin, on the other hand, has a wider range of close-range attacks with varying follow-ups, and all of his long-distance spells are fun to dodge or parry. He's never out of reach for too long either. It's a really long fight, but I'm not complaining. Every single minute of it is enjoyable, and the fun only increases as the fight progresses. I think the underground battle with him is objectively the best fight in the game, moveset-wise. It might not have the craziest spectacle of all time, but his abilities on their own do look really cool, so that kinda makes up for it. And gameplay is always king, and as such, Odin is king. Not story-wise. Story-wise, he's an asshole and got what he deserved. So, that's about it for this ranking. So will I do a video ranking all the optional bosses? Probably not. A lot of the harder endgame optional bosses are scaled ridiculously and have multiple enemies with them, and I know I need better gear to be able to beat them. I just don't feel like spending the time to get to that point. I don't enjoy the game enough for that. I was here for the story and the characters, and the story and the characters were great. But the gameplay just never really clicked with me. I know most people say the opposite, they want more gameplay, less story. I want more story so I don't have to play the game. Anyway, thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time, whenever the hell that is.